The Texas heat blazed white that morning, so bright it blurred the line between the sky and the dust. The trucks rolled in slow, engines sputtering through the dry wind, carrying 23 German women who hadn't spoken in hours. The road shimmered, the air thick with oil and cedar. Inside the truck, their gray uniforms, torn, sun-faded, clinging to thin shoulders, smelled of sweat and fear. They were nurses, typists, clerks. What remains when an army dies? The war had ended, but its commands still echoed inside them. Don't look, don't ask, don't trust. The gates of Camp Hearne creaked open. It didn't look like a prison. No searchlights, no snarling dogs, just wooden fences, a windmill turning lazily, and neat rows of barracks glowing dull beneath the sun. A few guards waited near the entrance, most barely 25. Texas ranch hands turned soldiers, their faces weathered and still. Captain Dale Cooper stood in front, lean, quiet, 33. Before the war, he'd broken horses, not men. His orders for the camp were clear. No shouting, no humiliation, no cruelty. The women stepped down one by one, blinking into the glare. No one barked orders. No one touched them. A guard extended a hand to help. But when the nearest woman flinched, he froze, then quietly lowered it. Annalisa Brandt, 24, was the last to disembark. Her boots struck the dirt with a muted thud. She braced herself for a shove or a command that never came. Cooper gave a single nod. "You'll have food and water soon," he said. The translator echoed it in German. She didn't believe it. That afternoon, they were led to their quarters. Wooden barracks, clean bunks, thin mattresses. One woman ran her fingers across a pillow as if it might vanish. "You'll wash before supper," a guard told them. The word froze them. Wash! They exchanged uneasy glances. They'd heard stories on the prison trains in Europe. The showers, the laughter, the shame. When sundown came, the air turned gold, and the wind fell quiet. The women gathered near the tin shower house, its single water tank humming above. The guards lined up outside. None entered, none looked back. Annalisa peered through the doorway. "They're waiting," she whispered. "For what?" the woman beside her asked. "To see us," she murmured. But when the water began to fall, there was no laughter, no jeering, only the soft, steady sound of water against skin and the quiet rhythm of boots standing guard outside. Captain Cooper remained near the windmill, hands behind his back, his shadow stretching long across the ground. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. Inside, the women stood beneath the warm stream, trembling, eyes shut, waiting for the cruelty that never came. And for the first time since the war began, they bathed without fear. They had come to America carrying two kinds of terror: what they had lived and what they had been told. In Germany, surrender meant disgrace. Soldiers whispered that in enemy camps, women were stripped, mocked, and broken. They believed the Americans hated them as fiercely as they fought. For the nurses and clerks now standing in Texas dust, capture was supposed to mean the death of dignity. But when the truck stopped at Camp Hearne, the story they'd been told began to unravel. The guards didn't curse or leer. They looked away as the women stepped down, as though the act of seeing might wound them. That was the first shock. The second came at dusk, when the word shower returned. Fear spread silently. The pipes rattled. Some clutched towels like shields. One woman whispered, "They'll watch." But they didn't. Outside, 10 guards stood 10 paces from the door, rifles at ease, faces turned toward the empty fields. Private Russell shifted nervously. "Sir," he muttered, "should we?" Cooper cut him off. "We guard from the outside. That's all." Inside, the first woman stepped beneath the stream. The water was warm, not scalding, not freezing, just water falling in rhythm, washing away dust and disbelief. One by one, the others followed. The sound softened. Panic gave way to breathing. When they stepped out, hair damp and eyes wide, the men still didn't move, didn't stare, didn't speak. The air between them was heavy, sacred, like the space between guilt and forgiveness. Annalisa lingered in the doorway. "They didn't look," she whispered. Greta beside her frowned. "Maybe they're ashamed." Annalisa shook her head. "No, they're protecting us," outside, Cooper finally said. "Supper in 20 minutes." His voice was steady, practiced, the tone of a man who had learned exactly what not to do. That night, Annalisa couldn't sleep. She replayed the sound of running water, the guards' turned backs, the strange mercy of being unseen. In her notebook, she wrote one sentence before the lights went out. "They looked away, and that's the kindest thing I've ever known." The next morning, she noticed something different. The guards kept their distance as always, but their silence felt lighter now, less like suspicion, more like intention. The women began to walk taller. The guards stopped staring at the ground, and in that narrow space between power and fear, a fragile order took hold. One built not on force, but on restraint. They had all entered the camp believing the other side was cruel. They were both wrong. Not hatred, but hesitation. Not shame, but silence. Not cruelty, but control. The war had ended on paper. But here, between two kinds of wounded pride, it was still being rewritten. One quiet act at a time. Before Texas, there was Bremen. Anna LeBrant could still smell the soot when she closed her eyes. The city burned 3 times before it broke, and she'd walked through it after each bombing, stepping over glass and twisted rails to reach the field hospital. She'd been a nurse since 19, trained to stop bleeding, not ask questions. The war had stripped her of more than faith. It had stripped her of the idea that gentleness could survive men. By 1945, she wasn't a believer in anything. When she was captured near Le Havre, she didn't cry. She didn't resist. She just waited for whatever came next. What came was silence, and that was the strangest thing of all. Camp Hearne had started as a training post in 1942, but by the end of the war, it was home to thousands of German PWs, farmers, U-boat sailors, engineers. Most were men. The women were different. There were only 23 of them, pulled from transport ships and reassigned here by bureaucrats who didn't know what else to do with them. The Army didn't plan for women prisoners. They improvised, and the man chosen to run their section was Captain Dale Cooper, a rancher from Abilene who'd traded a lasso for a Colt .45. He'd seen combat in France, but he'd lost more friends to exhaustion than bullets. He was a soldier because he had to be. But the old cowboy was still there, buried under the uniform. His men called him quiet, strange, too calm. But when he spoke, people listened. "You don't have to like them," he told his guards before the women arrived. "You just have to behave better than the men they ran from." The guards were farm boys, Texans raised on heat, horses and rules that didn't need to be written down. You didn't hit what couldn't hit back. You didn't stare when a woman looked away. You didn't cross a door that wasn't yours. That was Cooper's Texas, and now it was the camp's law. He kept a small notebook in his pocket. The first page read, "Command by distance, mercy by control." Every morning he made his rounds. He spoke little German, but he didn't need to. The women avoided eye contact. The men returned the favor. The silence worked better than orders ever did. The camp itself was plain. A grid of wooden huts, a kitchen, a latrine, a small garden plot near the fence. The windmill that powered the water tank was the only sound between meals. Cooper made sure it never stopped turning. "A man who can't give water," he said, "has no right to wear a uniform." That was why the showers mattered. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about proof. Proof that they weren't what everyone said they were. Proof that war hadn't broken everything. There were rules, written and unwritten. The Army's handbook said each P was to receive 1 bath per week under supervision. Cooper's revision was simple. No supervision, no shame, guards outside only. He didn't explain it, but the guards understood. They stood their posts, rifles ready, backs turned, eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't leniency. It was discipline. It wasn't leniency. It was discipline. The first week passed without incident. The women still flinched at every sound. The men still avoided looking directly at them, but something subtle had shifted. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It was cautious, yes, but balanced. Cooper's log entries were spare. Prisoners calm, ration sufficient, no issues. But one line stood out in smaller handwriting tucked beneath the official record. They don't trust kindness yet, but it's working. For Annalisa, the strangest part wasn't the food or the beds or even the warm water. It was the way the Americans looked away. They could have reminded her of everything the war had taken. Instead, they acted as if it hadn't been taken at all. When she lay awake that night, listening to the creak of the windmill and the far-off sound of crickets, she realized something terrifying and beautiful. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was being seen and spared. Not command, but care. Not power, but patience. Not redemption, but restraint. And it was that restraint, more than mercy, that began to heal her. War turned people into numbers, and Texas kept its books clean. 425,000 German PSWs were held in the United States between 1942 and 1946. 50,000 of them lived behind Texan fences, and among them fewer than 100 women. Fewer than 100 names buried in records labeled non-combatant female detainees. Camp Hearne had 23 women who no one knew what to do with. 10 guards, 1 captain, 1 unspoken rule. No man crosses the door when the women wash. The military ledger said, "Cleanliness essential for morale. Showers to be conducted under armed supervision." Captain Cooper crossed out the last line. Wrote instead, "Supervision unnecessary. Trust is stronger than inspection." That was his heresy and his experiment. Every detail was measured. Water rationed at 40 gall per hour. 2 minutes per woman, 10 FT between door and guard. Cooper had calculated the entire ritual like a mathematician, not out of sentiment, but out of discipline. If every step had a rule, nothing could be misread. Nothing could be violated. Inside, the women had their own numbers. 16 steps from bunk to shower house, 4 steps down to the door, 2 knocks before entry. They counted everything because numbers meant control. Control means survival. But what neither side counted was the silence. The silence had its own math. 30 minutes of running water. 10 men outside unmoving. 0 voices. 0 laughter. 0 eyes crossing that wooden wall. Those 0 told the real story. They were impossible numbers in war. 0 misconduct, 0 punishments, 0 complaints. The records would later call Camp Hearne's female detachment anomalous, amiracle by omission, a proof that mercy could be written in the negative. To Annalisa, it was something stranger. The guards' refusal to look wasn't just obedience. It was effort. She could see it in the way their shoulders stiffened when they heard movement, the way they forced their gaze outward. Mercy, she realized, wasn't softness. It was labor. That understanding came with shame. "We were ready to hate them," she whispered one night. "We wanted them to fail." Greta nodded. "So we could be right." "But they didn't," Annalisa said. "They keep not failing." Outside, the guards measured time differently. They didn't count women. They counted seconds. The length of each rotation, the hum of each valve, the shift of weight in their boots as the water started and stopped. Every motion was ritual, and every silence was a promise. Private Lewis once asked, "Why do we bother, sir? They wouldn't do the same for us." Captain Cooper replied, "That's why we do it." He knew the math of destruction. Tons of bombs, millions of shells, hours of slaughter. But this was the opposite, the math of decency. 10 guards, 23 women, 3 showers a week, 0 incidents, and an equation that shouldn't have worked, but did. Each number was a quiet rebellion against everything the war had taught them. Annalisa began keeping her own record in the back of her diary. She drew 2 columns, before and now. Before hunger, shouting, eyes, now food, silence, distance. She added a line at the bottom. Before fear meant survival. Now silence does. The next day, Cooper read a report from another camp, one where order had failed, where a single guard's mistake had destroyed months of fragile trust. He folded the paper, looked out at the Texas sun, and whispered, "That's what mercy costs when it breaks." He didn't know his own camp statistics would vanish after the war. No medals, no mention, just zeros in forgotten files. But those zeros were everything. They were proof that civilization hadn't died completely in 1945. Because in a world obsessed with how many enemies it killed, Camp Hearne was one of the few places that counted how many it didn't. Not victory, but vigilance. Not forgiveness, but distance held steady. Not absence of violence, but the presence of control. The math of restraint, the hardest equation any soldier ever kept. The test came when mercy met instinct. It happened quietly, as most things at Camp Hearne did. A slip, a moment, a choice. It was a Sunday afternoon, wind low, heat sharp enough to make the tin walls hum. The women had just finished their weekly laundry, scrubbing their uniforms in galvanized tubs near the shower house. The air smelled like soap, iron, and sunlight. Anala was wringing out a towel when her hand slipped. The edge of the metal basin caught her wrist, slicing deep enough to bleed. She gasped, pressing her hand to her chest, blood bright against the gray fabric. A guard nearby, Private Russell, heard it. He took one step forward before stopping dead. He looked to Captain Cooper, who was standing under the windmill with a clipboard. Cooper nodded once. Russell approached. Slow, careful, the way you'd walk toward a wild horse. "You hurt?" he asked. Annalisa didn't answer. She backed away, clutching her hand, waiting for the roughness that always came next. The grab, the yank, the humiliation. But Russell didn't move closer. He crouched, pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, and set it on the ground between them. "You can use that," he said quietly. "Clean cloth." He didn't reach for her, didn't insist. He just waited. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then she bent, picked up the handkerchief, and wrapped it around her wrist. "Donka," she whispered. Russell nodded, stepped back, and said, "It's okay, ma'am." That word, ma'am, hit harder than kindness. No one had called her that in years. The other women had watched, frozen. When he walked away, one of them whispered, "He didn't touch you." Annalisa's voice shook. No, he didn't. From the shade of the windmill, Cooper exhaled slowly. "That's it," he murmured to himself. "That's how you win." Later that day, he called his men together. "You all saw what happened. That's the line. You protect it. You keep it. No matter what." Lewis frowned. "Sir, it's just a cut." "It's never just a cut," Cooper said. "It's what comes next that counts." That night, the camp was quiet. The women washed again at sundown. The guards stood their distance, same as always, eyes fixed on the horizon. But something in the air had changed. Less fear, more trust, a fragile truce sealed by a single unbroken boundary. When Annalisa returned to her bunk, she opened her small notebook. On a torn scrap of the handkerchief, she wrote, "He left it on the ground." That phrase became a kind of prayer in the camp. Words passed between women when doubt returned. He left it on the ground, meaning Hagava help, not harm. The next morning, Cooper added a line to his logbook. Assistance rendered. No contact. 2 words that meant everything. Days later, a storm hit. Thunder over flat land, rain falling in thick sheets. The women rushed to secure their laundry lines, laughing as the wind whipped the sheets into ghosts. Cooper watched from his post, water dripping from his hat. It was the first time he saw them laugh without fear. Lewis grinned. "Guess they're not scared anymore, sir." Cooper didn't smile. "No," he said. "Now they're human again. That's scarier." The storm ended before sundown. The air smelled clean. In the fading light, the guards lined up outside the shower house, same as before, backs turned, boots planted in the wet earth. Inside, the women bathed in the warmth left by the storm, water mixing with rain. Annalisa raised her wrist to her face, the cut already fading beneath the white cloth. She thought of the man who hadn't touched her, the man who'd called her ma'am. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She whispered to the woman beside her, "They're not our captors." "What are they, then?" She looked toward the closed door where the silhouettes of cowboys stood against the last light. "Our witnesses," she said. "Not conquerors, not saviors. Witnesses to the possibility that decency could survive anything." That night, as the last drops fell from the roof, Cooper closed his eyes and listened. The sound of rain was the same as water on skin, steady, clean, endless. And for a few minutes, the world felt forgiven. By winter, the silence had become ritual. No orders, no shouting, no fear. Only distance measured in footsteps in seconds. The system worked because everyone obeyed the math of restraint. 23 women, 10 guards, 1 captain, 0 violations. But holding that number steady took more effort than anyone admitted. Cooper knew it. Mercy, he realized, was a kind of ex hostion. Every man on the line felt it. The constant control, the quiet tension of being good when it would be easier to stop trying. He began to notice small cracks in the rhythm. A guard who stared too long at the ground as the women passed. Another who lingered by the showers after dismissal, just listening to the sound of water. It wasn't lust. It was curiosity. Themine's dangerous drift toward what was forbidden. He called them together one night by the windmill. The air was cold, their breath visible. "You've been perfect," he said. "And that's the problem. Perfect breaks first," Lewis frowned. "Sir." Cooper looked past him toward the lights of the barracks. Discipline doesn't mean never wanting to fail. It means not letting it show. Hedis missed them early, stayed by himself a while, hat in hand, listening to the creak of the tower above. The water tank groaned. The sound reminded him of the first week, the first shower, the same uneasy stillness before trust began. Inside the barracks, the women were changing too. They'd stopped jumping at every sound. They'd started singing while they worked. Their fear had thinned, and something softer had taken its place. But that new calm brought its own confusion. One night, Annalisa found herself standing by the window, staring toward the line of guards. They were shadows in the moonlight, motionless, eyes turned outward. She wondered what it must feel like to hold back every instinct to protect someone by pretending not to see them. In her journal, she wrote, "They make us safe by pretending we aren't there. But maybe that's harder than cruelty." The next morning, one of the guards, Private Harland, approached Captain Cooper, hat in hand. "Sir, I'm requesting reassignment." "Razin?" Cooper asked. Harlan hesitated. "It's not right, sir. The way they look at us now, it's grateful." "I can't stand it." Cooper studied him for a long moment. "You're not the first man who's felt shame when he's done something right. Go. You've earned the transfer." Harlan left the next day. That night, Cooper sat at his desk, the lamplight flickering against the log book. He wrote, "Every man here's at war with himself, and we're losing slower than usual." The next evening, the water tank cracked again. The women stopped what they were doing, listening as the guards ran toward the noise. The hiss of steam filled the air, and for a second, the scene replayed itself. Men moving, women watching, everyone frozen in the same fear of crossing the line. But Cooper stopped them with a single order. "No one goes inside." They waited silent until the steam cleared. Then he nodded to the women. "You can handle it. Go on." Anala stepped forward, took a wrench, tightened the valve. The hiss faded. The guard stepped back. Afterward, she turned to Cooper. "We can fix what's broken," she said in careful English. He nodded. "So can we." When the water began to flow again that night, it sounded different, softer, slower, almost human. The women didn't cry this time. The men didn't look away in pain. Everyone just breathed. But Cooper knew what the silence meant. The system was holding barely. Mercy could only last as long as exhaustion allowed it. And when the last man, too tired to care, finally turned around, the whole thing would break. He closed his notebook with a sigh. The math was simple, but brutal. Discipline equals distance plus time. Desire. He looked out the window at the line of barracks, their shadows long under the moon. The women were sleeping. The guards were standing still. The camp was a perfect equation balanced on one impossible number. 0, he whispered. Just hold. Because once you teach men to stop fighting, you have to pray they never forget how. Not peace, but pressure. Not kindness, but calculation. Not freedom, but the fragile physics of decency. And all of it, every rule, every breath could collapse with a single step forward. February 1946. The cold came late that year, sliding across Texas like a thin gray sheet. The mornings were pale, the ground stiff with frost. The women woke early, breath clouding in the barracks, hands raw from washing uniforms in freezing water. The guards moved slower, too, stamping their boots to keep blood in their feet. One morning, the pump feeding the water tower froze solid. No showers, no water for cooking, no warmth except what the small stove in the barracks could give. By noon, tempers were thin. The women muttered among themselves in German. The guards shifted in the yard, waiting for orders. Captain Cooper arrived with a spanner and a bucket of boiling water. "We'll fix it," he said. Private Lewis hesitated. "Sir, shouldn't we?" "I said we'll fix it," Cooper repeated. He didn't mean the machine. He meant the mood. He approached the frozen pump, the metal white with ice. Steam rose as he poured the hot water over the valve. Nothing moved. The pump groaned but didn't give. From behind the fence, a voice called out in accented English. "More hot." Cooper turned. It was Annalise, her arms wrapped in a blanket. She pointed to the pipe, nodding like a nurse diagnosing a patient. "You hit then pour." He frowned. "You think so?" She nodded. "We do this in Bremen. When pipes freeze, you must hit first, then heat." He handed his wrench to Lewis. "Do what she says." The guard struck the pipe. Once, twice, the ice cracked. Steam hissed. Then the pump shuddered, coughing out a rush of brown water before clearing to clear steady flow. The tank above them rumbled awake. A cheer went up from both sides of the fence. Small, uncertain, but real. Cooper turned to Anaïsa. "You've done this before." She smiled, a thin, cautious smile. "Many winters, always cold, always pipes." He nodded. "Well, you just saved breakfast." That night, he sent 2 of his men to deliver an extra crate of firewood to the women's barracks. They didn't enter. They just left it by the door. The next morning, the crate was gone, and in its place sat a note written in German. Careful block letters translated later by a clerk. "For the water, thank you. For the distance, thank you more." It wasn't signed, but everyone knew who'd written it. After that, the boundaries began to shift again. Not closer, not broken, just warmer. The guards no longer stood like statues. The women no longer averted their eyes every second. When they passed each other near the mess hall, some nodded, others murmured greetings. Annalise began volunteering in the infirmary, tending to small cuts and sprains. She didn't speak much English, but she didn't need to. Her hands were steady. When she wrapped a guard's bandaged wrist one morning, she said softly, "No pain now," he answered. "Only tired." She smiled faintly. "War makes everyone tired." That night, Captain Cooper wrote in his logbook, "They fix what they can. We hold what we must." The balance still holds. The next week, rain came. Real Texas rain, thick and heavy. The camp turned to mud. The showers filled with steam again. The guards took their places, same as always. Backs turned, rifles resting. Inside, the women watched insolence, their voices mixing with the rain. Through the tin walls, Cooper could hear faint singing, a German hymn, quiet but steady. It wasn't for God. It was for themselves. When they stepped out, the mud pulled at their boots. Cooper tipped his hat, nodded once. "Evening, ladies." Annalisa hesitated, then said in halting English, "Good night, Captain." It was the first time she'd used his name. He turned away before she saw him smile. Not command, not forgiveness, just something rare. Mutual grace learned through repetition. For the rest of the war, Camp Hearne's water tower never froze again. And somewhere in the file room of the U.S. Army, a note was added to the end of a routine report. Prisoner morale high. Relations between guards and female detainees exemplary. The kind of sentence that hides an entire story inside it. A story about pipes, frost, distance, and the strange warmth that can live even inside captivity. Not love, not peace. Just proof that decency, like water, finds its own level. March 1946. The bluebonnets had started blooming on the edge of the camp. Small flashes of color against the pale earth. The wind was softer now, carrying the smell of wet grass and cedar. For the first time in months, the war felt far away. That morning, an army jeep rolled into Camp Hearne. Out stepped Major Whitman, a logistics officer from the regional command. His uniform was crisp, his tone harder than the weather. He was there to inspect. "Captain Cooper," he said, shaking his hand with the stiffness of someone already suspicious. "I've heard you run this camp differently." Cooper didn't blink. "We run it right." Whitman scanned the yard, his eyes landing on the women moving between the barracks and the shower house, their posture calm, unguarded. They seem too comfortable. "They're clean," Cooper said. "Comfort's just the side effect." Whitman frowned. "I read your reports. No discipline issues, no incidents, not one. You expect me to believe that?" Cooper shrugged. "You don't have to believe it. You just have to see it." Whitman spent the day observing, walking the perimeter, watching guards at their posts, scribbling notes. That evening, he returned as the women prepared for their shower rotation. The same ritual, the same silence. "Where's your supervision?" he asked. "Outside," Cooper replied. "I mean inside." "There's no inside supervision," Cooper said. "They're entitled to privacy under Article 12 of the Geneva Convention." Whitman snorted. "You're telling me you just let them in there alone?" "Yes, sir." "And the men just wait?" "They wait," Cooper said evenly. "And they don't look." Whitman's jaw tightened. "You're a damn fool, Captain. You've forgotten what they are." Cooper's voice stayed low. "No, sir. I remember exactly what they are. That's why this works." The major turned on his heel and left, muttering about softness and scandal. That night, the guard stood outside the showers as usual. The sound of water filled the air, rhythmic, constant. But there was something else beneath it. A song. The women were singing again. The same hymn, faint but unmistakable. Whitman heard it from his quarters. "They're singing," he said, disgusted. "You've turned this place into a sanctuary." Cooper didn't argue. He only said, "It's cleaner than a battlefield." The next morning, the major ordered a surprise inspection. He demanded to walk the barracks, check supplies, question prisoners. Cooper followed him silently. The women stood straight as he passed, their eyes steady but unafraid. When he reached the showers, he hesitated. The air was still damp from the morning wash. Soap and steam clung to the walls. "They should be supervised," Whitman said again. Cooper pointed toward the doorframe. "Look at the floor." The major frowned. The wood there was worn smooth, not from boots, but from the guards who had stood in the same spot every night for 6 months. Unmoving. "That's supervision," Cooper said. "Discipline leaves marks, too." Whitman didn't respond. He left 2 hours later, his report unsigned. That evening, Cooper gathered his men. "You did well today. You stood straighter when he was watching, but you never stopped facing the field. That's the kind of strength he'll never understand." Lewis grinned. "Reckon he'll shut us down, sir?" Cooper shook his head. "No, he's going to pretend we don't exist. It's easier that way." Inside the barracks, the women passed around small sheets of paper, scraps torn from old Red Cross forms. On them were short notes written in careful handwriting. Thank you for silence. Thank you for distance. Thank you for not changing when they came. Annalise folded hers and slipped it under Cooper's office door that night. He found it later. Simple, unsigned. He didn't keep it in his journal. He kept it in his breast pocket. The camp carried on. The showers steamed. The guards waited. The world forgot. But the moment had been tested, and it had held. When the next shipment of supplies came in, the Army clerk at the depot read the file marked Hearne P. Detachment Female Section. Next to the column labeled Security Complaints, there was just one word typed neatly in black ink. None. Not peace, but proof. Not command, but conviction. Not weakness, but the weight of doing nothing when everything in you wants to act. And that, Captain Cooper knew, was the real war. And somehow, in this tiny camp lost tow time, they'd won it. April 1946, the orders came through like they always did. Thin, typed, indifferent. Female German prisoners to be repatriated by end of month. It sounded clinical, almost bureaucratic, but in Camp Hearne, it felt like thunder. The women lined up by the gate that morning, uniforms pressed, hair neatly braided. The guards stood opposite them, silent. For 6 months, they'd lived in a fragile truce, built out of restraint, repetition, and the sound of water falling behind closed doors. Now it was ending. Anala clutched her small notebook to her chest, the one filled with half English, half German notes about the strange decency she had seen here. She looked at Captain Cooper standing near the trucks. He was the same as always, hat low, sleeves rolled, face unreadable. The translator read the instructions. You are going home. You will be transported to Galveston, then to Europe. Your conduct here has been noted as exemplary. The word hung in the air, awkward and heavy. Exemplary. It meant nothing to soldiers, but to these women it meant everything. Annalisa stepped forward, holding something in her hand, a folded towel embroidered with a single word. Danke. She hesitated, then extended it toward Cooper. He shook his head. Keep it. No, she said softly. You kept us clean. It's yours. He took it slowly. It wasn't me. It was the rules. She smiled faintly. Rules don't look away. Men do. He had no answer. Behind her, the others bowed deeply before climbing into the trucks. The guards removed their caps. No one saluted. No one spoke. As the engines rumbled to life, the dust lifted off the road, swirling like smoke. Cooper stood still, the towel still in his hands. When the last truck disappeared over the horizon, the camp felt hollow, too quiet, even for Texas. That night, he opened his journal for the final time. His handwriting was smaller now, more deliberate. German women, no incidents, no violations, no shame. The record will say nothing happened here, but something did. We proved it's possible. He closed the book and looked toward the shower house, the tin roof glowing faintly in the moonlight. The door was open. The air inside was dry, still smelling faintly of soap. He thought of the sound he'd heard for months, the rhythm of water, laughter muffled by walls, the silence of men who stood guard over decency itself. Not one of them had crossed the door. Not one, he whispered to the empty air. That's how wars should end. The next morning, when the army truck came to dismantle the camp, the workmen found a note pinned to the shower door in faded handwriting. They couldn't read the German, but later someone translated it. They waited outside. That is why we survived. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Years later, when the land was returned to ranchers, all that remained were the foundations of the barracks, a rusted windmill, and the concrete base of the old shower house. On it, the faint outline of 2 boot prints faced away from the door. Maybe they belonged to Cooper. Maybe to some nameless guard who never broke the rule. It didn't matter. They were proof that something sacred had existed there, a boundary that had held against the worst the world could offer. The war had taught men to kill without flinching. Camp Hearne had taught them something harder. How to hold still when every instinct screamed to move. Not conquest, but conscience. Not pity, but patience. Not victory, but the quiet triumph of control. The trucks carried the women home. The silence stayed behind. Years later, the Texas field where Camp Hearne once stood lay open again. Just grass, wind, and a rusted windmill creaking against the horizon. The barracks were gone. The fences had rotted into the dirt. Only the concrete foundation of the shower house remained, its edges cracked, the ground around it smooth from rain. Old men said you could still hear the wind sing through the grass, the way it used to hum through those tin walls. Not ghosts, just memory that refused to fade. In 1955, Captain Dale Cooper returned. He wasn't in uniform anymore, just a rancher once again, boots caked with dust, hat shading eyes that had witnessed too much. He pulled his truck up by the fence line and walked toward the old foundation. His hand brushed over the coarse concrete, feeling the same cold divide that had once stood between two worlds. Fear and restraint, foe and fellow human. He still carried the towel Annalise had given him, folded carefully in his shirt pocket. The stitching had faded, but the word remained. Danke. He placed it gently in the dirt and murmured, "You earned that, not me." The wind rose, stirring the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and distant rain. Half a world away, in Bremen, Anna sat at her kitchen table, silver hair pulled back, a bar of American soap wrapped in linen resting beside her cup of tea. She had never used it. When her granddaughter once asked why, she smiled and said, "Because it smells like mercy." The girl hadn't understood. Few ever did. That night, Annalise opened her old notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile, its ink almost gone. On the final page she had written long ago, they waited outside the door. That's all they did. That's everything they did. She closed it and stared through the window toward the harbor lights. Outside, the wind sounded like rain, like water falling softly on tin. In Texas, Cooper stood a little longer, watching the sunset fade over the plains. He thought of all the reports he had filed, numbers that meant nothing to anyone else. 23 women, 10 guards, 6 months, 0 incidents, a perfect equation in an imperfect world. He turned to go, then paused and looked back one final time. The windmill creaked, its blades turning slow, steady, endless, he whispered. Not weakness, just strength shown differently. Then he climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving the field to its silence. The sun dipped beneath the horizon, and for a heartbeat, the wind sounded like flowing water again. The same sound that had once filled that camp, the sound of compassion disguised as duty. Because in that forgotten corner of the world, between shame and dignity, between fear and restraint, the war had ended once more, quietly, rightly, completely. Not through triumph, not through surrender, but through something rarer, the courage to simply wait outside.